How many of you do have friends or coworkers or others that you've met who are Muslim? Okay, how many of you, well, you've all been keeping up with the news. There's a lot that is going on, and we need to understand. So this class is to help us understand how we can better deal with Islam for ourselves and reaching out. Okay, so I have an image that we're going to use on the website, Engaging Islam, and as we go through, and I'm going to use a lot of presentation stuff. That's kind of my way of teaching, but it covers a lot of material. I will have these PowerPoints available, so you can take notes, feel free, but I go through a lot of material, and they'll be on the website, and I'll show you how to get to that. In fact, you have it in your sheet there for those of you who have a sheet. Okay, this is the verse that we're going to use. This is our guiding verse. This is 1 Peter 3:15. We will be bringing scripture into it weekly, especially as we deal with the Quran as well, looking at a comparison. This is one of my favorite verses. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who gives you the reason, who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. So two things here. You need to understand what Islam is all about. But before that, you need to understand what you believe. And I tell you, as you deal with other religions, one thing that I really enjoy about working with world religions and apologetics is that people ask me questions, and I feel like I need to find out the answers. I've learned more theology. More of my theology has come from dealing with cults and religions and other things. So that's the way it'll be for you all. We'll deal with the Trinity issues. We'll deal with the deity of Christ. We'll deal with the authenticity of the Bible and things like that, but through the eyes of Islam. Okay, format. You have this on your sheet, so if you do have a sheet, if you could take this up. And this gives a schedule at the top. We'll be looking at that in a moment, but about midway through, you have four things that I'll be trying to do in each lesson. One, we'll be looking at the traditional view of the Muslims. I want you to hear from Muslims themselves what they believe. You need to have that. Secondly, we'll look at the counter view. The counter view is dealing with history, logic, theological truth. What does it say about the traditional view? We'll see that there are a lot of inconsistencies. And that is very important for us to know as Christians because we are being fed by the media a lot of false things that aren't accurate at all, and we need to be aware of that. In fact, I've been thinking about it, and there's really a false history that's been written. We talk about fake news, but we've got a lot of fake history too that we've got to weed through and look at. So we'll do that, and that's where the apologetic conclusion or implications will come in. What does it mean if we look at the counter view and there are inconsistencies? What are the implications of that for us, for Christians, for Christianity? And then fourthly, we want to build bridges. So each class, I hope to have a little section on how we can use this information that we're going through to reach out to Muslims. And we build that up, and we'll get a much better idea, and you'll see that it really boils down to two words: building relationships. But there are many ways to do that, and there are many layers of that. Now the schedule, you have that also on the sheet. Looking at the top part, this gives you a good idea of where we're going. So what we're going to dig into. We're going to look at the origins of Islam a little today. We'll probably continue some of that on as we go through. Next week, Muhammad, we're going to focus on Muhammad. He's the key principal person. Is Muhammad a prophet of God? We've got to ask that question. The week after that, sources of Islam. The Quran, Hadith, how the Bible fits into that, because they do take a lot from the Bible. Is the Quran the Word of God? So we'll be looking at that. And then September 10th, the expansion of the empire. This is fascinating because there's a lot of false information that's gone out about the expansion of Islam and what really happened. And this has been kind of my focus area of study for a number of years. So that will be fascinating. Then we're going to look at some theological questions on the 17th. Big ones, the nature of God. Is the Father of Jesus the God of Muhammad? That was the title of the speaker we had last week, Timothy George. He wrote a book on that, excellent book, and we'll look at that question. The nature of Jesus, how does Jesus fit in? Because Muslims will say, we love Jesus. He's our prophet. He's a great person. He did miracles. He was born of a virgin. And you'll see all these similarities, and you're wondering, wow, what's different then? Well, the differences are very, very large. So we'll have to look at that. 24th, we'll look at beliefs and practices, 5 pillars, and that's kind of the core of Islam. Simple in one way, complex in another. October 1st, 3 debates, 3 early debates that they had when they were going through that philosophical period are very important to us. I mean, free will or fatalism, predestination, what does that all mean, especially through the eyes of Islam? Is the Quran eternal? Is salvation by works or by faith? Good questions for us too. And then we'll go on to sin and salvation in Islam. Can Muslims have assurance? Do we have assurance? Why do we have assurance? So I'll keep on bringing it back to us because we need to understand what we believe and why we believe it, especially because they're going to ask us these questions. Can Islam be reformed? That's right before Reformation Sunday. So it's a very big question because there are some Muslims who really are trying to reform Islam, and I appreciate their efforts, but there's a really difficult thing. The 29th, October 29th, we'll be out of town, so I'm going to have a special guest come in. And I'll tell you more about that later. So that'll be on the 29th. November 5th, Islam and the end of the world, eschatology. What is the final goal for Islam? You'll be surprised because they believe that Jesus is coming back. Did you know that? They believe in the second coming. They believe that Jesus is coming back. But it's the Muslim Jesus, and he's going to be a very different Jesus. Very different. So that'll be interesting. November 12th, the reason for the Crusades. We keep on hearing this. What really happened? Why did it happen? We'll look at those general questions. Then jihad and ISIS. What is the crisis of ISIS? And it's a big thing in the news. And I wish we could take the whole semester on that, but we'll focus on that. Then back to some theological questions that often come up, always come up. How do we explain the Trinity to a Muslim? Third question that they'll ask you is always going to be the Trinity. Nice 3 there. Third question. It's always going to come up. How are you going to answer it? That's why a lot of Christians don't talk to Muslims or witness to them. They don't know how to answer the questions. Can we know whether Islam or Christianity is true? How do we know that? We'll look at the ways of looking at that. This one's going to be very, very helpful. December 3rd, Wind in the House of Islam. What is God doing in the Muslim world? He's doing a lot. In fact, we'll find out that this is the most fruitful time ever in the 1400 years of Islam. And we'll see some of the stories and hear really, really positive things that God is moving. Aslan is moving through the land, indeed. And then December 17th, reaching out to Muslims with the gospel of peace. We'll focus on bringing all these little tidbits together that we cover week by week. Nabil Qureshi, I put a link here. I'll mention that to pray for Nabil because Nabil is 34 years old, former Muslim, been a Christian for 10 years, vibrant testimony, brilliant young man, and he's written 2 of the best books on Islam. Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. How many have read this? Okay. Just one of the best. That's the first one to get. He wrote another one, No God But One, Allah or Jesus. He deals with a lot of the theological questions. Excellent book. Nick Chatrath has a good book on evangelism. I have these books down here. I'll have them on the table. You can look at them afterwards. In fact, if you could just take those and start passing those around. Another one, Answering Islam, is well done. Norm Geisler, the great theologian, has written a very good book on that. And with Abdul Salib, who's a former Muslim from Iran, a friend of mine who is really brilliant. Pastor now in the Atlanta region. And he witnesses to Iran through satellite TV and has brought thousands and thousands of Iranians to the Lord. You know, there's probably about 1 million Christians in Iran. It's amazing what's going on in Iran. And then 2 books. One that I've written is my scholarly book. That's on sale at the bookstore downstairs, down in the bridge. And I'll have copies as well. That gives you a lot of the background of what we're going to talk about. This is a book that I was hoping to finish by class time, but it's got another month or so. We're trying to get it done by September 15th, so we'll have that out. But this follows kind of the schedule you have. So it'll kind of give all the background and depth to what we'll talk about, because we can't talk about everything in the time that we have. But that'll be coming out, Christian's Guide to Islam. But the other one, it will be, I'll bring some copies each week, and then you can also get some at the bridge. The church is selling those. Okay. Primary assumption that I have as I'm going through all of this material is this. Have you heard of the law of non-contradiction? Law of non-contradiction basically says you cannot have 2 different religions saying the same thing in the same sense at the same time. In other words, one is true and the other one is false. Or both are false. Both cannot be true. So if Christianity is true, Islam is false. If Islam is true, Christianity is false. They cannot be both true because they're so opposite each other. In fact, when we look at these differences, these are the main differences we'll cover in different ways. They believe in Tawhid, which is the singularity of God, that he cannot be a trinity, and yet we believe in a triune God. Very different. They believe Jesus as a prophet, but only a prophet, not God at all. But we believe that Jesus is God himself. That's diametrically opposed. They believe that Jesus was taken into heaven and did not die on the cross. He was not crucified. But we believe, of course, that he was crucified. And he rose from the dead. Otherwise, what is Christianity? It's not much. It doesn't offer much hope. But because Jesus actually died and rose from the dead, we have hope. But they discount that. They believe that the Bible is, originally from Allah, but that it was corrupted. And so they don't trust it. We've got to get back past that. We've got to get them to trust it so that they can go ahead and, as they read through, be taught by the Holy Spirit. So these are 4 diametric opposites. So they can't both be true. So that's why I go back to the law of non-contradiction. I believe that Christianity is true, wholeheartedly. And the more and more I look at the differences and the questions that people bring up, my faith becomes stronger in that conviction. And that's what I hope will happen with you all too. As we go through this, deal with the depth of these issues, that your faith will become stronger in what you believe. So ground rules. Most Muslims in the world want the same things that we want. Peace, prosperity, something for their children, hope for the future. They're just like us. Most of the ones that you will meet here in the States are like that. But worldwide, about 15% are said to be radical Muslims. They have a radical mindset. Reading the same Quran, going through the same Sharia law, but they take it in a different way. Is that the right way or the wrong way? Well, we'll get into that as we go along. But 15% is pretty high when you're talking about 1.6 billion. So about 180 million, if you go with other estimates of 15 to 25% radical, then you're going up to 250 million. And so we're looking at a lot of people who do not like Christianity, don't want it around. We need to find out why, so we can find out how we can reach people like that, even like that. And there have been a number of radicals who have come to the Lord. They make good converts, really. They're passionate. One thing to keep in mind, most victims of radical Islamic terrorism, even now, are other Muslims. But they're considered the weak Muslims, the the nominal Muslims. So these radical Muslims feel like they've got to get them out of the way first, and then their ultimate goal is to get rid of Christianity and Judaism. But we'll talk about that. And I want us to think, when we think about Islam, think opportunities. And this is a very important positive aspect. There is a new wind blowing in the house of Islam. Think of this, for example. More Muslims have come to the Lord in the past 20 years than in the previous 1,400 years. More Muslims have come to the Lord in the last 2 decades than in the last 14 centuries. And there are statistics of, in some areas, some countries, hundreds of thousands. As I said, in Iran, close to 1 million. So around the world, tens of millions of Muslims. This is unprecedented. And they're having dreams and visions, and all these different supernatural things are happening in their lives. And God is at work, and we need to be part of that. We need to be encouraging that. So think about this too. I don't think Muslims are the problem. Islam is. And this is a way that has really helped me think through the issues. When I dichotomize in this way and say, okay, Muslims are not the problem. They're being led by a false belief. They are made in the image of God. We can love them. We need to love them. We are commanded to love them because they are our neighbors as well. And yet, we can criticize Islam because it is an ideology. It's a very strong, political, motivated ideology. And all ideologies can be criticized. So that's where the dichotomy helps me. That's where we can focus on, when we focus on Muslims, we can focus on how we can reach out to them in love rather than fear. So that's going to be important. And we need to realize that bad ideas have bad consequences. And Islam, I believe, is a bad idea. We'll talk more about that in time. And this is the real thing. Islam is keeping 1.6 billion people from seeing the beauty of the Lord. The one person who can truly open their eyes and make them see the splendor of eternity. They're following a false religion, a false gospel, a false message. And they do not know the true God. We can do something about that. That should be our focus. That's what drives me through this whole process. So I'd say Islam is the veil, and it's covering up what is beautiful in the people of Islam, the Muslims. And we need to uncover that. And we need to expose the myths. Any questions before we go into the lesson itself? Okay. Okay, what I'm doing in this first part, and for the first 3, is I'm going to show the two sides and pit them against each other to help you understand what's going on. Again, as I said, this presentation will be online. So there's a lot that's going on. Okay, forensic science. Archaeology and first-hand written documents are revealing a very different picture of the first 100 years of Islam. Very, very important stuff. The traditional Islamic view, what Muslims will tell you, states that an Arab named Muhammad received revelations from Allah through the angel Gabriel in a city called Mecca. Within 20 years after Muhammad's death, these revelations were written down in a book called the Quran. So we'll be looking at the Quran 2 weeks from now. However, new information is turning this traditional view upside down. And this is what is exciting to me as an historian. When you look at the history, the archaeology, the forensic evidence that we're uncovering every day, it's giving a very different picture of Islam from this traditional view. It's turning it upside down. I mentioned fake history. I think there's something to that. Think of this, for example. Mecca is considered the birth country, the mother of all cities to the Muslims. And yet, archaeologically, there are no artifacts before the 8th century A.D. As they're putting up skyscrapers now in Mecca to hold all the pilgrims that go there every year, they're digging down deep. They're not finding any artifacts. There wasn't anything there before the 8th century. It wasn't on the map until 300 years after Muhammad. That has to make you pause and wonder, well, what are we being told? That's historically valid, people will say. Of course Mecca was there. It's a thriving city. It had to be because Muhammad was there, and that's where they worshipped all these gods, and they had the Kaaba there and all these things. And yet, archaeology is giving a very different picture. So we need to understand what's going on. And Tom Holland and Dan Gibson will give you a good overview of that in those videos. We're learning that the Muhammad of traditional Islam was possibly an invention of a later Arab leader, that the Muhammad that we hear about was not the accurate or the actual Muhammad figure of the past. A lot of it's been built up over time. Well, when it's written down 200 years after the fact, that gives you some reason to understand that. That the Quran may not have been collected and written down until the early 8th century from many sources, including Christian and Jewish literature. A lot of the Quran comes from other sources, and that's an interesting way to look at it. That the city of Petra in northern Arabia may have been the birthplace of Islam instead of Mecca, which may not have been established as a city until after the death of Muhammad. So we're going to look at Petra in Jordan. Indiana Jones, that canyon of the half moon or something like that, that's Petra. And it fits a lot of the Quranic geography in. It's very interesting. So I'm going to blow your mind on a number of these things because it's counter what you hear. And Robert Spencer, who has written some good books in this area, another good writer, said the more one looks at the origins of Islam, the less one sees. Because it goes away. What they say didn't happen. And we need to understand that. So, let's look at the claim and counterclaim. When you see the mosque and this particular background, we're looking at what Islam says. Okay, so number one, Mecca was the birthplace of Islam. Now the counter view will have this background with this other smaller iconic mosque. Islam exposed. The actual birthplace of Islam may have been in northern Arabia, perhaps Petra. So here's Mecca way down here. It was not on any trade routes that it was supposed to have been. The trade route went through here. Mecca was off the trade route. And it didn't have anything really that was good for what was needed. Very little water. It's mostly dry and rocky. But it would have gone through Jeddah. But archaeology is showing that a lot of the people that are mentioned, there are only 9 places named in the Quran. Only 9. And Mecca is not one of them. There's a term, Valley of Bakka, that they say may have been Mecca. Mecca doesn't have a valley. Petra does. Petra has a very good pronounced vowel. So Petra may be the place where a lot of this started. That turns a lot on its head, and not Mecca. But we'll learn more about that. And if you watch those videos, it'll be very helpful for you. Another claim by Muslims. Islam began through a series of revelations to Muhammad, which became the Quran. Well, a number of scholars believe that Islam began out of apocalyptic Judaism, and that the real Muhammad was an apocalyptic preacher in the Jewish tradition, a Jewish Christianity, an amalgamation of these two, which we call an intermediate monotheism, in about the middle of the 7th century, the 600s. And it centered on Abraham and his son Ishmael. And that again, Ishmael settled up in the Petra region. Okay, the son of Abraham, and his descendants were up in that region. Third claim by Islam. Islam as a religion was fully formed by the time Muhammad died, fully formed. Well, Islam is very much a political religion. Some scholars claim that it was fashioned for political reasons, and it was not finished at that time. In fact, it kept developing, and my focus of my PhD was on this development through the eyes of John of Damascus, who was the chief financial officer of the Umayyad Empire about 70 years after Muhammad's death. And he was a strong Christian, Orthodox Christian, and he wrote about what he saw in two treatises, one called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. They were called Ishmaelites, not Muslims. And another one, a dialogue between a Saracen and a Christian. And so he's giving his reflections when he's safely ensconced as a monk in a monastery outside of Jerusalem and no longer in civil service under the strong Caliph Abdul Malik. But read my book and you'll get all that. Anyway, in the time of Abdul Malik, 685 to 705, 60 to 75 years after Muhammad's death, the need of legitimacy for their government was understood. So what I'm saying is that it was a development from this intermediate monotheism. And so to be a credible government, they needed a formalized religion, Islam, scripture, the Quran, and a prophet, Muhammad. So I think that those three things came together 70 to 100 years after Muhammad's death, in the late 600s, early 700s. And it developed even into that century. In the early 700s, some scholars say there was an intermediate monotheism forming. That was an amalgamation of Jewish and Christian influences that over time, because of influence from heretical, unorthodox Christian views, the monophysites and the Nestorians, just think of them, they were heretics of a sort, and they incorporated a strong animosity for central Christian doctrines such as the deity of Christ and the Trinity. So the intermediate monotheists, they believed in a God, but they had Jewish traditions, they had Christian traditions, but it was not Judaism and it was not Christianity. It was an amalgamation that was developing. There's also a stronger Jewish element that pushed this agenda. In fact, when you look at Islam and the Sharia law, a lot of it is very similar to Old Testament law. But after the conquest started up, Jews were also marginalized and in time vilified in later writings. There was a breakup. Why? That's a really interesting mystery. And there are some good threads to that and possible answers. So this intermediate monotheism could have risen out of an Ebionite influence. They were early Christians that were very Jewish in their worship, or from a form of Arianism. Arius was the heretic that was denounced at the Council of Nicaea for saying that Jesus was created. He was the first created thing. He didn't exist always with the Father. And a lot of early Christians in Europe were even Arians. So this could have come out of Arianism. The Arabs were pagans before Muhammad came to convert them to Islam, fourth claim by Muslims. Arabs were pagans. But we find out that inscriptions show that there were a lot of Christians and Jews in that area, and people called Hanifs, who were believers in the one God. They were monotheists, but they weren't Christians or Jews, so it could have been out of all of this. Fifth claim, Islam began with the Hijrah, the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina in 622 AD. We'll talk more about this next week when we look at Muhammad. This Hijrah, that's the date that they give for the beginning of Islam. But Hijrah also means emigration. And you can understand this now with the refugee situation. And in 622, after the Byzantines conquered the Persians, there was a big war going on against the Byzantines, who were the Christians centered up in Constantinople, Istanbul, and the Persians, Iran. And they had been going at it for about 100 years, and finally the Byzantines were tired out. They conquered to an extent. In 622 may be the date for the Byzantines giving the Arabs in that area self-rule again. So that's why they date their beginning from 622, because it could have been that. Anyway, the Byzantines pulled out, left all of that Christian land up in Syria open. Nobody was guarding it. Byzantine soldiers were gone. And so these refugees from Arabia were coming up, probably from northern Arabia. But because they were coming up, they were settling, and they were conquering, and they were taking advantage of the situation. And so the earlier refugees became the conquerors. And so the early conquests of the Negev, Egypt, so Saudi Arabia here, you have the Negev up here, this is Israel along here, Petra would be up here. This is probably where a lot of it occurred. southern Syria. Interesting. Southern Syria is possibly growing rage and immigration of the Arabs into the areas due to the pulling out of the Byzantine troops, laying the land wide open. It's interesting that the first refugees went up into Syria. Now we're getting all the Syrian refugees coming out of that because of war, because of battle, because of it trying to escape. And the abandoning of the Federati, who were no longer receiving tribute. The Arabs were being paid to guard the borderlands. And when the Byzantines pulled out, there was no paycheck anymore. They didn't have any income. So what are they going to do? They went back to their raiding ways. And then you have the wars going on. You do have historical records of these internal battles and people then escaping and going northward. So history gives a very different tale, and that's what's interesting. Okay, another claim by Islam. The words Islam and Muslim are part of the inscription around the Dome of the Rock, built in 691. So they say, oh, well, Muslims were well known by 691. It's the first mention of those terms by Muslims. But they did not come into vogue until about 745, when they were calling themselves that. They were called other names. They called themselves Muhajirun, those who are on migration. The Syriac term for that would be Maghreb. They were also known as Mu'minin, or believers. And Fred Donner, a good historian from Chicago, University of Chicago, wrote about this. The Mu'minin, that's what they called themselves. Believers. Believers in what at that time? It was kind of intermediate. The Arabs were not called Muslims until the middle of the 8th century. So they were called Muhajirun, those on an immigration. Mu'minin, believers. Saracens, away from Sarah, wife of Abraham. Hagarenes, Hagar, going back to Hagar, or Ishmaelites. And that area really was in the northern part of Arabia, not the southern part. So it's very interesting when you look at those things. So the Dome of the Rock inscriptions could be an expression of a theological, this is Robert Spencer, quote from him, could be an expression of a theologically uncomplicated Arab monotheism that is deeply concerned with Christ and Christianity, to the point of polemicizing against claims of Christ's divinity. They believed in Christ as a prophet, but not as God. So the inscriptions, these early inscriptions put up there by Abdul Malik, may have been his way of saying, okay, we've changed the nature of religion. This is the religion of the area anymore. Christianity is out. And Jesus is not God. He is just a prophet. Do not say three. Do not say Trinity. That's what was being put out. Good propaganda for an early government. This preoccupation with Christ leaves us far short of Islam in a clearly recognizable form as a religion of Muhammad and the Quran. And Spencer finishes up by saying, by that point in history, the specifics of that religion still had been nowhere elaborated. In other words, nothing had been written down. It was still formulating. It's still building up. That's what we see with John of Damascus, who was lived from 675 to 750. This was the period that he was witnessing, that he wrote on, and that we have a record of. Okay, so my conclusion. The best evidence we have today seems to reveal a slow development of the Quran from non-Muslim sources. In fact, as we get into it, we'll see that there are stories in there that are from poetry, Arab poetry, Christian poetry, Jewish poetry, the story of the 7 sleepers in a cave. That was a 3rd century Christian legend. What is it doing in the Quran? A lot of things like that were just kind of pulled in. From non-Muslim sources, primarily Syriac, that were adopted and incorporated into an intermediate monotheism that was neither Christian nor Jewish, but which was influenced by beliefs from both. So that Jewish-Christian amalgamation. At first, it was the religion of the elite, the leaders, but as the Arabs became more successful and began to settle in their conquered cities, the leaders recognized that they would need to fortify their hegemony by establishing their religious beliefs, authorizing their own scriptures, and supporting their own prophet. So that was part of it. For many Christians at that time, like John of Damascus, this new religion was understood as just a heresy of Christianity with anti-Christian beliefs and a false prophet. fact, he starts off in the book. I translated his Heresy of the Ishmaelites, and he starts off saying that it was a coercive religion, and that led to the idea of the Antichrist. He called Muhammad, or Mahmed, the Greek term, he called him a false prophet, and mentioned the writings of Muhammad as being ludicrous. So again, he's fortunate that he was in a monastery and away from purview and writing in Greek, which they couldn't read. So he said these things at that time. What was going on? As time went on, however, written in Arabic as well as the scripture written in Arabic became standardized, and Muhammad became established in a religion that would soon rival Christendom. So this is what's going on there. And we have about 2 minutes left. What we're going to do with building bridges, I'm going to pause, or at the end of each time, 5 minutes or so, we'll look at ways. How do we develop true friendships with Muslims? How do we build trust? We need to ask good questions. We need to read the Gospels together. We need to get them to the Gospel, trusted enough to start reading, because that's where they're transformed. And pray for the Muslim friends.